Hello, this is Jerry with Canna Intel 420, and before we get into Ohio deciding that voters are apparently just unpaid interns for the legislature, yes, we have to do the disclaimer. Because somewhere in a state office, there is absolutely a Buckeye-fed paperwork goblin twitching in a swivel chair, praying for the chance to act like context is a felony. So, here it is. This content is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice, financial advice, or regulatory instruction. It does not promote or encourage the use, sale, or cultivation of cannabis where prohibited by law. Always follow your local, state, tribal, and federal laws and regulations. There. The compliance cryptid has been fed. The committee cave trolls may return to their filing cabinets. The legislative gremlins can stop sharpening their little citation knives for 5 seconds. Now let's get into what actually happened in Ohio, because the public voted to legalize cannabis, and somehow the power structure still found a way to climb in afterward and start rearranging the furniture. Ohio voters approved Issue 2 in November 2023 by 57.2% to 42.8%. That part is settled. The part that changed later is the operating structure. Issue 2 was a citizen-initiated statute, not a constitutional amendment, so the General Assembly could rewrite it through ordinary legislation. It did exactly that through Senate Bill 56, signed in December 2025 and effective March 20, 2026. Ohio did not cancel adult use legalization, it narrowed it after the public vote. That is the starting fact, and it matters because this entire fight turns on that difference. Legalization survived, but the terms of legalization changed after the electorate had already spoken. Adults 21 and older can still legally possess up to 2.5 ounces of marijuana and up to 15 grams of extract, and home cultivation still exists at 6 plants per adult with a cap of 12 per residence. But Senate Bill 56 also tightened the legal channel around that use. It adopted a THC calculation based on Delta-9 THC plus 87.7% of Delta-9 THCA in plant material, capped adult use flower at 35% THC, and extracts at 70% THC, and restricted smoking, combustion, and vaporization to privately owned residential or agricultural property. The revised definition of adult-use marijuana also ties lawful marijuana to marijuana cultivated, processed, dispensed, tested, possessed, or used in accordance with the statute, which effectively excludes marijuana products produced and dispensed outside Ohio's licensed structure. That is not a cosmetic edit. It means the state did not just legalize use. It legalized one approved supply chain and reserved the ability to treat other channels as unlawful. That changes what legal means in practice. A broad legalization model reduces the amount of ordinary conduct that can still be treated as suspect. Ohio moved in the other direction. Consumer legality remained, but the state fenced it in harder. A person can live in a legal state and still be operating inside a much narrower compliance corridor than the election results suggested. A home grower can stay within the plant count limit and still see the surrounding legal environment shift towards stricter product definitions, stricter use location rules, and more explicit control of what counts as lawful marijuana in the first place. That is not repeal, it is controlled permission. The revenue side changed just as clearly. Under Issue 2, the 10% adult use excise tax was allocated 36% to the Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs Fund, 36% to the Host Community Cannabis Fund, 25% to the Substance Abuse and Addiction Fund, and 3% to administration. Under Senate Bill 56, the 10% tax stayed, but the allocation changed to 36% for the Host Community Fund and 64% for the General Revenue Fund. The social equity and jobs allocation disappeared from that structure, so the public voted for one revenue model and the legislature later installed another. That is a concrete redistribution of who benefits from legalization over the long term. The licensing structure moved in the same direction. Issue 2 created a Level 3 cultivator category capped at 5,000 square feet for social equity applicants, limited to 40 licenses, and it also contemplated 50 dispensary licenses tied to that same social equity and jobs framework. Senate Bill 56 eliminated the Level 3 category and eliminated those 50 dispensary licenses. It also replaced the earlier expansion logic with a hard cap of 400 dispensary licenses statewide. Those changes matter because smaller footprint licensing is one of the few tools states have to widen participation and reduce concentration. When those smaller lanes are removed after the market is already moving, the market tilts harder toward already capitalized firms and the medical infrastructure that was already in place. Ohio lawmakers did not make those changes to a dead market. They made them to a live one. Adult use sales began on August 6, 2024. By early January 2026, adult use sales since launch had reached roughly $1.09 billion, including more than $836 million in calendar year 2025 alone. At the start of January 2026, Ohio had around 190 dual-use dispensaries. By March 18, 2026, the Division of Cannabis Control reported 204 dual-use dispensary certificates of operation, 23 Level 1 cultivation certificates, 14 Level 2 cultivation certificates, and 6 dual-use cultivation certificates, while cumulative program sales had risen above $3.6 billion. Those are the numbers of a functioning market with real demand, active stores, and substantial revenue flow. They are not the numbers of a system collapsing under its own weight. This point, I feel, needs to stay front and center because it answers one of the easiest political defenses. I say this so a hostile listener can't oversimplify this by saying adult use still exists, stores are open, and prices have come down somewhat, so the legislature was simply cleaning up an immature market. Ohio's own sales and licensing numbers weaken that defense. Consumers were already buying at scale. Stores were already operating at scale. Revenue was already flowing at scale. The market did not need to be invented. It already existed. What changed was who got more protection inside it, who lost future entry lanes, and where the tax value would flow once the market matured. That is a much narrower and more defensible claim than saying Ohio undid legalization. It did not undo legalization. It restructured the gains from legalization after the vote. Local moratoriums make that restructuring visible in daily life. Ohio law allows municipalities and townships to prohibit adult-use cannabis businesses in their jurisdictions. Existing medical operators already located there cannot be blocked in the same way, but new adult-use business access can be. If the Division of Cannabis Control issues a dispensary license in a locality without a moratorium, that locality still has 120 days to pass an ordinance prohibiting operations, and the dispensary then has 60 days either to shut down or pursue a petition process that goes to the next general election. As of March 5, 2026, 149 municipalities or townships had enacted moratoriums. Of those, 125 active moratorium jurisdictions represented around 14% of Ohio's population, and of the 131 ordinances reviewed by Ohio State's Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, 128 were full moratoriums covering all adult use operator types. That is not background noise, that is a built-in access constraint. That is where the lived consequence comes in. A person can live in a legal state and still have no normal local retail access because their township or municipality chose to block new adult use operators. That consumer still counts in the state's legalization statistics, but their actual options may be to drive to another jurisdiction, pay whatever the available market charges there, rely on informal channels, or grow at home if they have the space and tolerance for the risk and effort. A home grower can assume they are outside the political fight because they are not buying from dispensaries, while the local board or township trustees are making decisions that shape the market around them anyway. A smaller operator can be fully compliant and still find that legal geography itself has been narrowed before they ever get a real chance to compete. That is what it looks like when a legal market exists on paper but remains uneven in physical reach. The comparison to Texas works at the level of structure, not because the statutes are identical. In both places, political actors can keep the market divided through restriction, definitional narrowing, local control, and enforcement architecture. The legal market is allowed to exist, but on terms that favor concentration, preserve confusion, and keep enough friction in the system that informal channels do not disappear cleanly. Then the same distortions can be cited later as proof that cannabis itself remains disorderly. That is the trick. The disorder is often presented as the product. In reality, much of it is the product of design. Ohio fits that pattern because the state kept legalization formally alive while making the lawful route narrower, more heavily defined by the state, and more favorable to already positioned operators than the original ballot result implied. Something else that I need to state plainly because it makes this whole argument harder to attack. This is not claiming adult use was repealed. It was not. It is not claiming every local moratorium is corrupt. It is not. It is not claiming every price premium or every market distortion is artificial. It is not. The narrower claim is stronger. 57.2% of Ohio voters approved legalization. The legislature later narrowed the terms through Senate Bill 56. The tax structure was redirected away from the social equity model voters approved. Smaller participation lanes were cut back. Local governments retained broad blocking power. And all of that happened while a billion-dollar adult use market was already functioning. That is enough to say, defensively and without exaggeration, that Ohio moved from voter-approved legalization toward a more controlled, more restrictive, and more incumbent protective form of legalization after the public vote. What this produced in practice was an adult use market built on medical incumbency. Ohio did not launch adult use by first opening a broad retail field to new independent entrants and then letting competition sort itself out. It launched adult use by converting the existing medical system into the first adult use channel. As of August 2024, Ohio had 126 medical dispensaries with certificates to operate, and those operators were eligible to transition into dual-use sales. Ohio's adult use sales then began on August 6, 2024, through that converted structure, with 98 dispensaries approved on launch day and the count expanding from there. That means the first serious advantage in adult use was not better execution, lower pricing, or stronger consumer pull. It was pre-existing licensure, pre-existing facilities, pre-existing municipal siting, pre-existing compliance systems, and pre-existing shelf access. The firms already inside the medical market got first control over adult use traffic. That point needs to stay blunt because legalization gets heard by the public as market opening. In Ohio, the opening was filtered through the old medical architecture. It was not a blank slate. By March 18, 2026, the Division of Cannabis Control reported 204 dual-use dispensary certificates of operation, 37 cultivator certificates of operation, 46 processor certificates of operation, and 6 testing laboratory certificates of operation. Adult use expansion was not initially a story of broad new ownership entering the field. It was a story of licensed incumbents extending themselves into a new revenue stream while the state continued to permission the rest of the market around them. The concentration risk is not just that large firms were present. Large firms were structurally advantaged before broader competition had time to form. Issue 2 had created smaller participation lanes, including a Level 3 cultivator category capped at 5,000 square feet for social equity applicants and 50 dispensary licenses tied to that same track. Senate Bill 56 later eliminated the Level 3 category, eliminated those 50 dispensary licenses, and imposed a hard cap of 400 dispensary licenses statewide. So Ohio did two things in sequence. It let medical incumbents convert first, then it narrowed some of the later entry paths that could have diluted that first mover advantage. That is not an accidental recipe for concentration. It is the kind of sequence that makes concentration more likely before the market ever has a fair chance to broaden. The economic effect is a little more straightforward. A true new entrant has to spend money discovering the market while surviving inside it. An incumbent does not. The incumbent already has real estate, operating procedures, staff, customer familiarity, regulatory knowledge, and supplier relationships. It can absorb slower margins for longer. It can spread costs across multiple stores or across multiple parts of the supply chain. It can survive price compression more easily because it entered adult use with advantages that a new independent operator did not have. When a state builds adult use on incumbent conversion and then cuts back smaller later entry lanes, the question is no longer whether incumbents have an advantage. They do. The question becomes how fast that advantage compounds. Ohio's structure gave it room to compound quickly. That inference follows directly from the state's licensing sequence and market design. The sales data shows why this mattered politically. By early January 2026, adult use sales since launch had reached roughly $1.09 billion, including more than $836 million during calendar year 2025 alone. By March 18, 2026, cumulative program sales had moved above $3.6 billion. Those are not pilot program numbers. Those are numbers from a functioning, monetized market. Once that much revenue is moving, control over who captures it becomes the real fight. If the market broadens, more of the value disperses across smaller operators, local entrepreneurs, and more varied retail ownership. If the market tightens after launch, more of the value stays with the firms already positioned to scale and the state institutions already positioned to tax it. Ohio moved more toward the second path than the first. That is why the rhetoric around order and public safety needs to be read carefully. A state can say it supports legalization while also capping licenses, preserving local moratorium authority, narrowing lawful product definitions, and eliminating smaller footprint entry routes. Technically, legalization still exists. Structurally, the market is being told who gets trusted first, who gets trusted later, and who may never get a realistic opening at all. That is not neutral administration, it is selection. The public hears legal market. The underlying system may still be deciding that legality will expand only through already capitalized channels and under increasingly controlled terms. The antitrust case filed by Ohio's Attorney General in February 2026 makes the concentration issue harder to dismiss as outside commentary. The lawsuit against 9 multi-state operators alleges anti-competitive conduct including reciprocal supply arrangements, non-public competitive information sharing, discriminatory supply terms, and shelf space allotments. Those are allegations, not adjudicated findings, and they should stay framed that way. But the fact that Ohio's own Attorney General put those allegations into court matters because it shows that concentration concerns are not just coming from policy critics or smaller operators complaining from the margins. The state itself alleged that major firms may have been shaping product access and price conditions in ways that distorted competition. One reported detail from that case is especially important because it translates concentration into something the public can recognize. MJ Biz Daily reported that, according to the lawsuit, 13 of Ohio's 60 counties with cannabis retailers had only multi-state operator-owned stores. That means a county can have legal retail access without having anything close to meaningful ownership diversity. A consumer walking into a store in one of those counties may think they are looking at a competitive market simply because a legal shelf exists. They are not necessarily looking at competition. They may be looking at a narrow ownership corridor. That difference matters because store presence and market openness are not the same thing. That county-level reality is where the lived consequence becomes easier to see. A person in a county dominated by one ownership class may have legal access, but not meaningful local choice over which business models survive, which products get promoted, or which firms get repeated shelf presence. A smaller Ohio operator may technically be legal and still be trying to sell into a retail environment already shaped by larger firms with more capital, more vertical depth, and better geographic positioning. So when the public hears legal market, it should not automatically picture a broad field of independent businesses competing on price, quality, and access. In many parts of Ohio, what exists is closer to a legal channel dominated by operators who got in first, scaled early, and then benefited from later legislative tightening. That is also why public behavior does not migrate cleanly into the regulated market just because adult use is legal. If the market is concentrated, geographically uneven, and politically narrowed, some consumers will enter it and stay there. Others will not. Some will buy legally because they value testing, convenience, or legal certainty. Others will keep using informal channels because prices remain high, local access remains weak, product selection feels constrained, or the legal market looks built around operator advantage instead of public service. That split then gets described as proof that cannabis markets are inherently messy. In reality, a large part of the mess comes from the design. Concentration and fragmentation are not side effects in Ohio. They are part of why regulated and unregulated behavior continue to coexist. Again, I feel something needs to stay clear here too. This is not claiming that no one benefits from Ohio's adult use market. Plenty of consumers have lawful access they did not have before. Plenty of businesses are making real money. This is not claiming every multi-state operator acted unlawfully. The antitrust case is still a case, not a final judgment. The narrower claim is stronger. Ohio built adult use on medical incumbency, let those operators convert first, preserved local veto points, narrowed some later entry lanes, and then watched ownership concentration concerns become serious enough that the state's own attorney general filed an antitrust suit. That is enough to say, defensively, that Ohio's adult use market expanded as a controlled extension of the old medical hierarchy rather than as a broadly democratized commercial opening. Ohio's hierarchy works like a control chain, not like an open market. The voters supplied the legal mandate in November 2023 when Issue 2 passed 57.2% to 42.8%. The General Assembly kept the power to rewrite that mandate because Issue 2 was an initiated statute, not a constitutional amendment. Senate Bill 56 then changed the operating terms effective March 20, 2026. The Division of Cannabis Control runs the license channel underneath that revised statute. Municipalities and townships can still block new adult use business activity through moratoriums. Inside that structure, the firms with the most leverage are not random new entrants. They are the operators that already had medical licenses, existing facilities, capital, and multi-state depth across cultivation, processing, and retail. That is the hierarchy in plain terms. Voters authorize, lawmakers rewrite, regulators gatekeep, local governments constrict geography, and incumbents monetize the openings that remain. The money flow follows the same hierarchy. A consumer purchase moves through a licensed dispensary, back through licensed cultivators, processors, and labs, and then into the state's tax structure. The adult use excise tax stayed at 10%, but Senate Bill 56 changed where the money goes. Under Issue 2, 36% was set aside for the Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs Fund, 36% for host communities, 25% for addiction services, and 3% for administration. Under Senate Bill 56, 64% goes to the General Revenue Fund, and 36% goes to the host community fund. The old social equity and addiction allocations are gone from that adult use tax split. So the public authorized the market, but the legislature redirected more of the durable cash flow upward into the general state budget after the vote. The licensing side is just as concentrated. As of March 18, 2026, Ohio reported 204 dual-use dispensary certificates of operation, 37 cultivator certificates of operation, 46 processor certificates of operation, and 6 testing laboratory certificates of operation. That is not a loose field. It is a tightly permissioned commercial network. Adult use sales began on August 6, 2024, but they began through dual-use conversion, not through a broad, fresh field of independent adult-use licensees. That matters because the first firms to control dispensary doors, cultivation throughput, and processing volume are the firms that get to shape what reaches shelves, which brands survive, and how hard independents have to fight just to be seen. That is why the February 2026 antitrust case matters. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost sued 9 multi-state operators, alleging anti-competitive conduct that reduced product choice and kept prices artificially high. According to the Attorney General's office, the case grew out of an October 2024 industry tip alleging widespread shelf space allotments. The complaint alleges reciprocal supply arrangements, use of non-public competitive information, and discriminatory supply practices that hurt independent Ohio cultivators and processors. These are allegations, not findings, and they should stay framed that way. But the state itself is now alleging that parts of Ohio's cannabis hierarchy may not just be regulatory. They may also be commercially coordinated in ways that shape what reaches the consumer before the consumer ever gets a fair market choice. That is the point where legal market and open market separate from each other. A cultivator or processor can be licensed, compliant, and capable of producing a better product and still get squeezed out if dominant dispensary networks reserve large blocks of shelf space for preferred partners. In that setting, the independent operator is not competing only on quality, price, or execution. It is competing against prearranged access. The formal market says the operator is legal. The practical market says the operator may still have no real route to the customer except through inferior terms, weak placement, or exclusion. That is how concentration hardens without anyone needing to announce that concentration is the goal. The lived consequence is simple. The smaller operator can do everything right on paper and still lose because the route to the consumer was filtered before the product ever arrived. The county-level ownership picture makes the same point with less abstraction. MJ Biz Daily reported that, according to the lawsuit, 13 of Ohio's 60 counties with cannabis retailers had only multi-state operator-owned stores. That does not mean there is no legal access in those counties. It means that legal access is filtered through a narrow ownership class. A county can have stores and still lack meaningful ownership diversity, meaningful local bargaining power, and meaningful competitive shelf dynamics. That is a major difference. A store exists is not the same thing as competition exists. A consumer walking into a licensed store can still be walking into a highly managed corridor. The pricing data fits that reading. MJ Biz Daily reported that average flower prices in early January 2026 were about $6.41 per gram, down from $6.85 a year earlier, and average manufactured product prices were about $23.83, down from $26.66. So prices were softening, which is what maturing markets usually do. But Headset's February 2026 Ohio market data still showed an average item price of $31.24, among the highest in the country, trailing only New York and New Jersey in its comparison set. That is the important combination. Ohio is no longer in pure launch scarcity, but it also does not look like a market where broad competition has broken pricing power. Prices came down at the edge while the market still carried unusually high average transaction values. That is what a constrained market often looks like. Local moratoriums intensify that structure instead of correcting it. As of March 5, 2026, 149 Ohio municipalities or townships had enacted moratoriums, and 125 active moratorium jurisdictions represented about 14% of the state's population. Of the ordinances reviewed by Ohio State's Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, nearly all were full moratoriums covering all adult-use operator types. That means the state is not just limiting who dominates the market, it is also limiting where the legal market can normalize geographically. When legal geography is fragmented, operators already sitting inside open jurisdictions gain more leverage over consumer traffic and supply movement. Scarcity stops being only about license count. It becomes spatial. The lived consequence is obvious. A consumer in a block township can live in a legal state and still have to drive elsewhere, accept the local ownership structure they find, or continue using informal channels. This is the deeper mechanics of concentration in Ohio. Revenue moves upward into the general fund. Licensing value moves inward toward operators already standing inside the regulated system. Shelf access moves inward if the antitrust allegations are even directionally accurate. Geography narrows where local moratoriums block new stores. Consumer choice narrows when the buyer sees only the filtered end result. That is why this cannot be described as product simply moving from cultivator to processor to shelf. The more important movement is power moving upward and inward. It shapes which products survive, which firms scale, which communities get legal access, and which later narratives get used to explain the market's supposed failures. One boundary needs to be kept explicit here too. This is not claiming that adult use was repealed. It was not. It is not claiming that every multi-state operator engaged in unlawful conduct. The case is still pending. It is not claiming that every high price in Ohio is artificial. The narrower claim is stronger and easier to defend. Ohio's adult use market sits inside a hierarchy where legalization survived, but the operating terms were tightened after the vote. Revenue was redirected. Local governments retained broad blocking power. Incumbents entered first through the medical system, and ownership concentration concerns became serious enough that the state's own attorney general filed an antitrust suit. That is enough to argue, without overreach, that Ohio's market is not behaving like a neutral legalization field. It is behaving like a tightly managed commercial corridor. Incumbent advantage in Ohio was built into the transition itself. Adult use sales opened on August 6, 2024, but the state did not begin by licensing a broad new field of independent adult use operators. It began by converting the existing medical system into the first adult use channel. Ohio had 126 operational medical dispensaries eligible to transition into dual-use sales, and the market opened through that converted structure. By March 18, 2026, the Division of Cannabis Control reported 204 dual-use dispensary certificates of operation, 37 cultivator certificates of operation, 46 processor certificates of operation, and 6 testing laboratory certificates of operation. That is the real shape of the market. Adult use did not arrive as a clean reset. It arrived through an already permissioned medical core. The firms that already had stores, grow capacity, compliance systems, local siting, and supplier relationships did not have to discover the market from scratch. They started in front. That advantage was reinforced through the next retail expansion phase. Ohio's 10B dispensary process did not wipe out the position of existing operators. It gave already capitalized firms another route to extend their footprint. Cannabis Business Times reported in July 2024 that the site selection process was phased, with each company first choosing one 10B site based on lottery order before later rounds allowed more selections, and the outlet reported that 4 companies appeared positioned to gain outsized advantage in that process. That matters because more licenses exist is not the same thing as new entrants can realistically challenge incumbents. If the expansion route is still tilted toward operators that already have capital, infrastructure, and relationships, legal access expands on paper while ownership power stays concentrated. Senate Bill 56 hardened that structure instead of loosening it. Ohio's final legislative analysis shows that the bill consolidated the adult use and medical licensing structure under one marijuana control framework. It also eliminated the Level 3 cultivator category, which had been designed as a limited footprint entry path, removed the additional dispensary opportunities tied to the social equity and jobs framework, and imposed a hard cap of 400 dispensary licenses statewide. That sequence matters. Ohio first let incumbents convert into adult use, then later narrowed some of the smaller entry paths that could have diluted that first-mover advantage. Once the low-scale on-ramp disappears, contesting market share gets harder, not easier. The enforcement side makes the politics clearer. Senate Bill 56 did not just change tax allocation and licensing categories. It also rewrote the legal perimeter around use and possession in ways that preserve visible enforcement hooks. The final legislative analysis says smoking, combustion, and vaporization of adult use and homegrown marijuana are restricted to private residential property and certain agricultural property. The Senate passed bill text and enactment summaries also describe transport restrictions in motor vehicles and misdemeanor exposure tied to prohibited public or vehicle use. That means Ohio kept legalization while preserving easy public-facing control points around where people use, carry, and consume the product. The market side gets commercial stability. The public side stays tightly supervised. That distinction affects how the public experiences legalization. A statute can say adult use is legal, but if public use is tightly restricted, vehicle conduct still carries criminal exposure. And lawful marijuana is defined as marijuana cultivated, processed, tested, dispensed, possessed, or used in accordance with the chapter. Then the state has not built a normalized public use model. It has built a compliance corridor. Outside that corridor, ordinary conduct can still be narrated as suspect or disorderly. The lived result is simple. Consumers can buy legally, but the state still keeps a dense set of visible rules around where legality ends and punishable conduct begins. There is another signal in the legislative history. Earlier analyses of Senate Bill 56 described repeal or narrowing of provisions that had protected adult use consumers from certain adverse actions by courts, police officers, healthcare providers, and regulatory authorities. The exact language shifted across drafts and enactment, so that point should be stated carefully. The stronger point is not that every proposed rollback survived unchanged. The stronger point is that the legislative direction ran toward tighter control, not broader normalization. That is consistent with a model in which incumbent operators receive commercial certainty while consumers receive a more conditional form of legality. The February 2026 antitrust suit filed by Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost makes the incumbent advantage problem harder to dismiss as theory. The Attorney General alleged that 9 multi-state operators engaged in anti-competitive conduct, including reciprocal trade agreements, sharing competitively sensitive information, and discriminatory distribution practices that disadvantaged independent Ohio operators. The state said the case grew out of an October 2024 tip alleging widespread shelf space allotments, and it alleged that some companies reserved substantial shelf space for products sourced through reciprocal agreements with one another. Those are allegations, not findings. But even at the allegation stage, they matter because they suggest that firms already favored by Ohio's transition structure may also have been shaping what consumers could see and buy inside the legal market. That is the asymmetry that matters most. Enforcement remains highly legible at the public edge of the market. Public use, vehicle use, transport, local bans, and compliance violations. But inside the licensed market, Ohio built a structure that privileged medical incumbents, narrowed later entry paths, and then became the site of state antitrust allegations involving shelf access and reciprocal commercial arrangements. So the everyday consumer remains easy to govern, while the deeper commercial concentration problem develops one level above them in a less visible space. That is not a contradiction, it is the pattern. Public-facing enforcement preserves the image of order, while ownership concentration grows behind the retail counter. One boundary needs to stay explicit here too. This is not claiming that adult use legalization was fake. It was real. It is not claiming every multi-state operator acted unlawfully. The case is still pending. It is not claiming every rule around public use is illegitimate. The narrower claim is stronger. Ohio structured adult use around medical incumbents, reinforced that advantage through later licensing choices, preserved visible enforcement hooks around consumers, and then saw its own attorney general allege anti-competitive conduct among major operators inside that favored structure. That is enough to say, defensively, that legalization in Ohio has been both commercially protective and publicly disciplinary at the same time. Ohio's wholesale problem starts with one basic fact. Cultivators and processors do not sell directly to the public. They have to reach the consumer through dispensaries. That makes shelf access the gate, not a side issue. If a cultivator or processor cannot secure stable placement, reorders, and promotion inside dispensaries, it does not matter that the operator is licensed, compliant, or making a product consumers would actually prefer. The Ohio Attorney General's complaint is explicit about the structure. Cultivators, processors, and dispensaries sit at different points in the chain, and dispensaries are the final point of sale to the consumer. That means control over shelf space is not just participation in the market, it is control over access to the market. That is why the state's February 2026 allegations matter so much. Ohio alleges that 9 multi-state operators used 3 connected methods: quid pro quo supply agreements, sharing of competitively sensitive non-public information, and discriminatory distribution practices. The complaint says the goal was straightforward: suppress independent Ohio rivals and keep Ohio cannabis prices artificially elevated relative to declining prices in other states. Those are allegations, not adjudicated findings, and they need to stay framed that way. But even at the allegation stage, this is not ordinary complaining about tough competition. The state is alleging a system for controlling what reaches shelves and what does not. The complaint gets specific enough that the shelf issue stops sounding abstract. Ohio alleges that some national reciprocal supply agreements, referred to as trade balances, were negotiated by senior executives across multiple states, then translated into state-level purchase quotas for local execution. The complaint also alleges that when local teams struggled to satisfy those quotas, senior executives intervened. It gives a concrete example. GTI and Ascend allegedly agreed at times to stock 25% of their Ohio dispensary shelves with each other's products. If that allegation is accurate, the shelf is no longer acting mainly as a merit filter, it is acting as pre-divided commercial territory. That changes wholesale leverage for independent Ohio operators in a very direct way. A smaller cultivator can have better flower, a stronger local following, or a more compelling brand and still walk into a buying process that is already partially spoken for. The complaint alleges that reciprocal trade and shelf arrangements created artificially and anti-competitively constructed barriers for independent Ohio cultivators and processors trying to win placement in defendant-controlled dispensaries. In plain terms, the independent operator is not just competing for a shelf, it is competing for whatever shelf space remains after larger firms have already made side arrangements with one another. That is a materially different market from the one consumers think they are looking at. The GTI internal language allegation is one of the strongest details in the whole case because it exposes the commercial logic without much interpretation. The complaint alleges that a GTI executive wrote in December 2024 that the company had materially changed how we buy and who we buy from because this is a distribution game, and that vendors were eliminated not only because they were underperforming, but also because they were not buying any product from our wholesale business. If true, that means shelf access was not always being decided by consumer demand or product quality. It could also turn on whether the other party was participating in the reciprocal commercial network. That is not normal competitive discipline. That is allegiance discipline. The pricing and promotion allegations make the picture worse. Ohio alleges that defendants offered each other discounts, rebates, vendor credits, and supported promotions that were not offered to non-MSO dispensaries. The complaint gives examples, including an alleged March 2025 arrangement in which Air and Verano valued bulk flower below normal rates to offset money owed under reciprocal supply arrangements, and an alleged 30% off Ohio promotion between Curaleaf and Verano supported through a split co-promotion reimbursement structure. If those allegations are correct, the distortion is not limited to who gets on the shelf. It extends to who can price effectively once on the shelf. The state's theory is blunt. Non-MSO dispensaries either keep higher prices and lose cost-sensitive consumers or match the lower price and absorb the margin hit themselves. That is where wholesale leverage becomes structurally one-sided. In a competitive market, retailers pressure suppliers on price, performance, and sell-through, and suppliers compete for placement by offering better value and stronger products. In the market, Ohio alleges some large operators were not simply competing harder. They were allegedly using reciprocal quotas to guarantee demand, shelf space allotments to protect access, and promotional support to preserve margin inside aligned channels. That means an independent producer is not trying to win a fair buying decision. It is trying to enter a commercial field where the buyer may already be economically committed elsewhere. The practical result is lower negotiating power, weaker reorder probability, thinner brand visibility, and less room to survive normal market volatility. The consumer side becomes impossible to ignore at that point. The complaint alleges that most of the top 10 most popular cannabis brands in Ohio are grown by Ohio operators with no affiliation to the defendant multi-state operators. If that allegation is accurate, the issue is not that weak brands are losing. The issue is that products with proven consumer traction may still be blocked from reaching consumers broadly because access to the shelf is distorted upstream. The complaint also alleges that obtaining a dispensary license is often not a realistic escape route for smaller independent operators because the licensing process requires substantial time and capital. That means the independent brand can get trapped from both directions, blocked from fair shelf access, and blocked from solving the problem by building its own retail outlet. The GTI August 2024 example in the complaint sharpens that consumer problem. Ohio alleges that a GTI buyer acknowledged that, while trying to meet a spending goal, a GTI Ohio dispensary accumulated inventory that did not perform as well as more popular brands and fan-favorite strains. That detail matters because it shows how a concentrated market can misread demand in a very ordinary-looking retail setting. The shelf stays full. The store still looks professional. The menu still looks legitimate. But the selection can be shaped by upstream reciprocal obligations rather than by what consumers actually want most. A buyer walking into that store sees a regulated shelf and assumes it reflects open competition. It may instead reflect upstream commercial commitments the customer never sees. That is why consumers can read a concentrated market as if it were neutral. Retail design creates that illusion naturally. A consumer sees multiple brands, menu options, promotions, and regulated packaging and assumes the shelf is a map of demand. In a concentrated market, the shelf can be a map of power instead. The customer does not see state-level quotas, reciprocal balance obligations, confidential discount structures, or unsupported brands that never got fair placement in the first place. The shelf looks like choice. The underlying process can still be heavily filtered. Ohio's pricing data makes that interpretation more defensible, not less. Headset reported that Ohio reached $88.6 million in sales in February 2026, with 13.9% year-over-year growth and 23.3% year-over-year unit growth, while maintaining one of the highest average item prices in the country at $31.24. In the same comparison set, Michigan averaged $8.88, Oregon $12.26, and California $18.44. MJ Biz Daily also reported that some Ohio retail prices did fall after launch, including declines of roughly 20.8% on a tenth of an ounce and 20.9% per gram between August and December 2024. Those two facts can coexist. Prices can soften from launch and still remain unusually high relative to more open, more mature markets. That is exactly the kind of mixed signal you would expect in a high-growth market where competition exists, but not enough to fully break pricing power. That pricing structure makes independent brand survival harder at every level. An independent operator has to survive licensing, compliance, testing, packaging, production, and normal cash flow strain. Then it has to survive a retail channel that, according to the state's allegations, may already be partly carved up through reciprocal supply and promotional arrangements. If it sells to non-MSO dispensaries, those outlets may themselves be disadvantaged if they do not receive the same discounts or supported promotions as the larger network. If the operator tries to solve the problem by building retail, the path is capital-intensive and slow. If local moratoriums block expansion in key areas, the route gets even narrower. So the operator is exposed from every direction. Weaker leverage at wholesale, weaker leverage at retail, weaker pricing support, weaker promotional support, and weaker ability to absorb delay. This is not claiming the antitrust allegations are already proven. They are not. It is not claiming every price premium in Ohio is the result of cartel behavior. It is not. The narrower claim is stronger. Ohio's market structure gives dispensary shelf access extraordinary power. The state has alleged that major operators used reciprocal arrangements, confidential information, and discriminatory commercial terms to shape that shelf access. Ohio still carries unusually high average item prices relative to more open markets, and those conditions make it far harder for independent operators to survive and for consumers to know whether the shelf reflects true competition. That is enough to argue defensively that wholesale leverage, shelf access, pricing power, and consumer perception are reinforcing one another inside the same narrow corridor of market control. Ohio keeps getting talked about like it is only a fight between lawmakers, regulators, and licensed operators. It is not. The people carrying the weight of this market are consumers paying the prices, small operators getting boxed off shelves, and home growers watching the state build a legal system around them while pretending they are politically incidental. They are not incidental. They are the public side of the market. They are the ones absorbing the cost of concentration, the travel burden created by moratoriums, the narrowing of legal access, and the slow conversion of legalization into a system that feels more supervised than free. Ohio law already gives them standing in the real sense that matters. A home grower who never applies for a license is still a voter, still a resident affected by local bans, still able to request records, still able to show up at meetings, still able to submit testimony, and still able to sign or circulate petitions. Ohio's Public Records Act gives access to any person, and the Attorney General's guidance makes clear that motive generally does not matter. The problem is not that ordinary people have no leverage. The problem is that they have not been organized to use it together. That is where this has to change. Small operators, consumers, and home growers cannot keep acting like they are separate constituencies with separate fates. They are getting hit by the same structure from different angles. The cultivator feels it when shelf access is distorted. The consumer feels it when product choice narrows and prices stay high. The home grower feels it when the state keeps tightening the public meaning of legal, while local officials block access and larger operators keep consolidating position. When a township blocks stores, the consumer drives farther, the incumbent gains more leverage where stores do exist, and the home grower becomes even more politically important because they are one of the few people left who can speak about quality, access, and local reality without needing permission from the retail channel. That is not symbolism. That is where the human part of this actually sits. First, the records. Because records are how ordinary people stop getting gaslit by official narratives. Ohio's Public Records Act is a self-help statute. That matters. It means there is no magic office coming to rescue the public if records are withheld or delayed. The public has to act. The Attorney General's office lays out the routes, including complaints in the Court of Claims and mandamus actions in other courts. So the real beginning is not more arguing online, not more venting, and not more waiting for somebody with money to fix it. The real beginning is building a records habit. Start pulling emails, calendars, meeting packets, ordinance drafts, zoning discussions, enforcement directives, and communications with lobbyists or trade groups from municipalities and townships with moratorium activity, from the Department of Commerce, from the Division of Cannabis Control, and from legislative offices shaping cannabis policy. That is how suspicion stops being a feeling and starts becoming a file. That work has to stay disciplined or it turns into clutter. The point is not to dump giant phishing requests on every office in the state. The point is to ask narrower questions over and over so patterns appear. Which localities are using the same language to justify blocking cannabis businesses? Which offices are producing records slowly? Which officials are meeting privately before public votes? Which communities are getting fed the same talking points? Ohio makes sunshine laws training publicly available for a reason. People should treat that like movement infrastructure, not like background reading. A small group that knows how to write narrow requests, track responses, spot bad redactions, and escalate denials cleanly is worth more than 100 angry posts. This is where the ordinary person starts to stop feeling powerless, because once you have records, you are not just reacting to a narrative anymore. You are documenting how the narrative got built. Next pressure point is elections, and this is where a lot of ordinary people underestimate what they can do because they keep thinking in moral terms instead of structural ones. Ohio's campaign finance systems are searchable. The Secretary of State maintains statewide and legislative campaign finance records, and county boards of elections handle local campaign finance filings and local petition work. That means people do not have to guess who is aligned with whom. They can pull the filings. They can map the donor patterns. They can stop treating every district like it is the same. Some districts are worth persuading, some are worth exposing, some are worth replacing, some are worth making more expensive for incumbents who keep siding with concentration, obstruction, or control. That is not abstract strategy. That is how regular people stop wasting time where the numbers do not support persuasion and start using their turnout, donations, and local energy where it can actually move something. That matters because not every community is dealing with the same version of this problem. One place is dealing with local moratoriums, Another is dealing with a legal market that exists but feels dominated by a narrow ownership class. Another is dealing with high prices and weak selection. Another is dealing with travel burdens because local officials blocked normal access. Those are different surface conditions, but they all point back to the same thing. Ordinary people are being forced to live inside a market structure they did not design and did not vote for in this form. 1,000 disciplined residents in the right district matter more than one more isolated business owner trying to survive alone. That includes home growers, especially home growers. They are residents first, and that means they count where it hurts most. Turnout, meetings, petitions, and local public pressure. The legislative side matters too, but it should stop being treated like a room that only lobbyists get to enter. Ohio's committee systems publish hearings, documents, and testimony procedures. Senate committee pages state that testimony can be submitted up to 24 hours before the meeting starts. That means consumers, home growers, and smaller operators do not have to beg some trade association to say what they are living through. They can put it into the record themselves. The strongest approach is repetition with discipline. Use the same factual backbone every time. The 57.2% vote, the narrowing that came later, the tax shift into the general revenue fund, the elimination of smaller entry routes, the local moratorium count, the ownership concentration signals, the pricing data, and the shelf access allegations. Then localize the damage. Show the drive time. Show the blocked municipality. Show the lost shelf access. Show the pricing gap. Show what it means in that district, not just in Ohio in general. That is how testimony stops sounding like generalized outrage and starts sounding like documented harm. The ballot path has to stay on the table for one reason. People behave differently when they know the public can go around them. Ohio's initiated statute process is real. It requires an initial committee, an initial filing with 1,000 qualified electors, attorney general review, ballot board review, and then a much larger statewide signature effort spread across counties. That is hard and it costs money, which is exactly why it should be treated as leverage even before anyone decides to fully use it. Once lawmakers believe people are serious enough to draft language, build county teams, and prepare circulation, the public stops looking like an irritated audience and starts looking like a counterforce. That changes the temperature. It does not guarantee victory, but it does stop the other side from assuming that frustration will just burn off harmlessly. The place where ordinary people are strongest is still local. That is where home growers matter more than they think. Local officials are often easier to pressure than state lawmakers. Moratorium politics are local. Open meetings are local. Ordinance fights are local. Public records fights are often local. A person who never intends to own a store can still show up, pull the emails, ask who was consulted, ask what evidence was used, and make local officials explain why a legal market keeps getting narrowed in their community. That is not a side role. That is one of the few places where the public can directly weaken the machinery that protects concentration. Ohio State's Drug Enforcement and Policy Center documented 125 active moratoriums as of March 5, 2026. That number is not just a policy statistic. It is a map of where ordinary people have been made to live inside a legal state that still withholds normal legal access. So the answer here is not come together in some soft, hopeful way. The answer is harder than that. Build one shared archive. Build local teams that know how to pull records and show up at meetings. Map the donors. Track the ordinances. Track the moratoriums. Track the committee calendars. Put lived examples into testimony instead of abstractions. Move to media only after there is already a paper trail. Put turnout and money only where the district math justifies it. Keep the initiated statute route alive as leverage. That is how this stops being three populations talking past each other and starts becoming one public block with legal tools, real records, and enough pressure to force a response. The people already have more power than they think. What they have not had yet is a structure strong enough to make that power visible. The people who need to be organized first are the people who can keep showing up without asking permission from the existing market. That means the work cannot start with whoever has the biggest business, the loudest voice, or the most social media reach. It has to start with people who can hold a county together when nothing exciting is happening. One person pulling records, one person watching local government, one person tracking elections and donor money, one person staying in contact with small operators, one person keeping consumers, patients, and home growers in the same conversation. That is not bureaucracy for its own sake. That is how ordinary people stop getting scattered every time the pressure shifts. Ohio already gives the public real entry points. Local governments control moratoriums and citing, county boards of elections handle local petitions and local campaign finance filings, the Secretary of State maintains statewide campaign finance records, and the Public Records Act gives any person access to records from public offices. The openings are already there. What has been missing is a structure that treats those openings like tools instead of trivia. The first person you need is the records lead because records are how people stop being talked over. Ohio's Attorney General says plainly that the Public Records Act belongs to any person, that a requester generally does not need to identify a motive, and that the law is a self-help statute. That means regular people are allowed to force visibility onto the people making these decisions. The records lead is not doing clerical work in the background. They are building the factual backbone that keeps everyone else from getting trapped in rumor, selective memory, or official spin. If a township suddenly claims it blocked cannabis businesses for community safety, the records lead is the one who pulls the emails, calendars, drafts, and meeting materials and finds out who was actually talking to whom before the vote. If a public office stalls, over-redacts, or refuses to produce records, the records lead is the one who knows that Ohio provides formal routes to challenge that through the Court of Claims or by mandamus. That is where a lot of ordinary people start to feel their footing again, because once documents start coming in, the whole fight stops feeling like people yelling into fog. The first records request should stay narrow enough that people can sustain them. That part matters because burnout usually starts when people try to demand everything at once and end up with nothing they can sort or compare. Ask the same core questions in every county and every municipality that matters. Ask for communications about cannabis moratoriums and zoning restrictions. Ask for communications with lobbyists, trade groups, dispensaries, cultivators, processors, and lawyers about cannabis citing or regulation. Ask for calendars and meeting records for the officials handling cannabis decisions. Ask for ordinance drafts and internal discussions. Ask for records showing enforcement directives or coordination involving cannabis businesses or public use issues. Do it the same way across counties. The reason is simple. One document is interesting. A pattern is politically dangerous. When the same language, the same timing, or the same outside influence starts showing up in multiple places, the public finally has something stronger than frustration. It has evidence that can be compared, published, and confronted. The next people you need are the ones who will watch local government, because this is where a lot of the real damage gets done while the public is looking somewhere else. Ohio State's Drug Enforcement and Policy Center reported 125 active local moratoriums as of March 5, 2026. That is not just a policy statistic. That is a map of where ordinary people are being told they live in a legal state while being denied normal legal access in practice. The job at the local level is not just to be involved. It is to sit in the room, watch the agenda, read the packet, and ask the questions officials usually hope no one will ask. Who did you meet with before this vote? What evidence did you rely on? Why has this ordinance not been revisited now that adult use sales have been live? Why are local residents expected to drive out of town for access that the state says is legal? Those are public questions. They belong to the people living there. That is where the home grower matters more than they think, because a home grower is not just somebody with plants. They are a resident who can speak about what the market actually feels like on the ground when local officials keep pretending that blocking access is neutral. The election side has to be treated just as seriously, but not in the empty way people usually talk about elections. This is not about telling everyone to go vote and pretending that fixes structure by itself. Ohio's campaign finance systems are searchable. The Secretary of State handles statewide candidates, PACs, parties, and legislative caucus campaign committees. while county boards of elections handle many local campaign finance reports and local petitions. That means people can stop guessing who is tied to whom, pull the filings, build donor maps, track them over time, stop treating every district as if it deserves the same hope or the same energy. Some districts are still persuadable, some are not. Some are districts where the only real goal is to expose hypocrisy, cut margin, and make continued obstruction more expensive. That is not cynical, that is disciplined. A district where lawmakers keep protecting concentration while drawing money from the same ecosystem behind it should not be treated like a misunderstanding. It should be treated like an alignment problem. That is also why the operator-facing work matters, but it cannot be allowed to swallow the whole effort. The point is not to gather every small business in Ohio into one room and hope they all suddenly become a movement. Start with the operators already living the squeeze most directly. The cultivators and processors losing shelf access, the non-dominant dispensaries dealing with weak wholesale terms, the businesses getting slow-walked or undercut. Their role is to stop reporting their pain like scattered anecdotes and start documenting it like a pattern. Track lost accounts, track reorder times, track discount demands, track promotional support, track weak placement, track whether opportunities dry up after refusing reciprocal behavior or one-sided commercial terms. Those details matter because they turn "the market feels rigged" into "here is how it is behaving." Smaller operators do not need to be the only face of this effort, but they do need to become one of its best sources of pattern recognition. That is how their voice becomes usable instead of isolated. The home grower side cannot be treated as a symbolic add-on. That was part of the problem before. Home growers are not just hobbyists standing outside the serious fight. They are part of the only public layer that still has a degree of independence from the shelf. They know what access feels like when local government blocks stores. They know what quality looks like outside the menu theater of the regulated market. They know what it means when the state keeps saying legalization exists while the reality around them keeps tightening. In practical terms, they are useful in three ways immediately. They fill meetings, they circulate petitions, and they provide quality and access testimony that does not read like pure business self-interest. That matters a lot. A lawmaker can brush off one more operator complaint as greed. It is harder to brush off a room full of residents, home growers, patients, and consumers all saying the same thing with records in hand. The statewide initiated statute process makes that even more important because Ohio's process starts with a petitioners committee, an initial filing with 1,000 qualified electors, and then much larger statewide signature requirements after Attorney General and ballot board review. That means a home grower network is not peripheral, it is possible petition muscle. The monthly tracking work has to stay small enough that people will actually keep doing it. Track the active moratorium jurisdictions in the area, track local ordinance changes, track committee hearings touching cannabis, local government, taxation, criminal law, agriculture, or commerce, track campaign contributions into target districts, track average retail prices using the same basket each month. Track shelf diversity in a small standard sample of dispensaries, how many total brands, how many clearly local independent brands, how many tied to dominant multi-state operators, how many promotional slots, how often the same corporate families keep reappearing. Track what consumers are actually complaining about: price, distance, weak product choice, poor quality, confusing rules. Track records compliance too: who answered, who delayed, who over-redacted, who forced escalation. None of that sounds glamorous, but glamour is not what builds leverage. Continuity builds leverage. Markets and political actors survive when the public keeps forgetting what happened 3 months ago. Monthly tracking is how that cycle gets broken. Testimony should come before media most of the time because testimony puts the public's voice into an official record first. Ohio Senate committee pages state that testimony may be submitted up to 24 hours before a meeting begins. That matters because it means regular people do not have to wait for a major trade association, a lobbyist, or a friendly lawmaker to speak for them. They can put the facts and the harm directly into the record themselves, but the testimony has to stay disciplined. One hearing, one issue, moratorium abuse, price distortion, shelf exclusion, ownership concentration. Do not try to pour the whole state into every single hearing. Put one documented piece of damage in front of them at a time, then keep doing it. After that, go to local and regional media with something concrete in hand. The filing, the district impact, the records behind it. That order matters because once the story is in the public record, it stops feeling like just another opinion and starts carrying institutional weight. Media work should stay close to where people live before it tries to go statewide. A county-level or metro-level record story will often do more real damage than a giant statewide culture war frame. Give reporters a zoning story tied to actual documents. Give them a donor map tied to an actual district. Give them a shelf diversity and price comparison story tied to an actual store pattern. Give them testimony tied to actual names and actual communities. That is how people start seeing themselves in the story. If this goes statewide too early in a giant abstract frame, it gets flattened into ideology. If it stays rooted in local records and local harm first, then the statewide story later has something real to stand on. That is how pressure starts to feel cumulative instead of performative. The election pressure has to move in waves or people will quit. This is where the human side matters again. People burn out when they are treated like permanent emergency labor. They stay in it when the work has rhythm and when that rhythm produces visible outputs. During quieter parts of the year, focus on records, meetings, testimony, and donor mapping. When filing windows, campaign finance deadlines, and primaries start approaching, then shift into district scorecards and turnout work. Let people see the cycle. Let them see what the work is producing. A donor map, a county brief, a testimony packet, a local story, a price comparison, a record of who blocked and who answered. When people can see the trail they are making, they stop feeling like they are just feeding their energy into a hole. County captains should be built by workload and geography, not ego. One captain for a county with multiple active municipalities is rarely enough, but too many early leaders usually means drift. The better structure is one county captain with role leads under them for records, local government, elections, and community or operator intake. Keep the first 90 days simple enough that people can survive them. First month, map the county's officials, stores, moratorium history, ordinances, and likely allies. Second month, file the first records requests and attend the first meetings. Third month, publish a county brief showing who holds power, what they have done, what the local market actually looks like, where the barriers are, and what needs to happen next. That kind of brief matters because it proves the work is real. It also stops knowledge from living only inside one exhausted person's head. And if this grows enough, then it stops being just defensive work. Ohio's initiated statute pathway is real. It is hard, but it is real. An initial committee, an initial filing with 1,000 qualified electors, attorney general review, ballot board review, and then the larger statewide signature requirements spread across counties. The point is not to romanticize that route. The point is to understand what it does politically even before it is fully used. When lawmakers believe people are serious enough to draft language, build county teams, and prepare signatures, the public is no longer just reacting. It becomes a counterforce with a route around legislative refusal. That changes the fight. The sequence that keeps people strongest is records first, testimony second, local media third, district pressure fourth, election work fifth, and ballot planning only if the normal channels stay blocked. That is how scattered frustration turns into something durable enough to matter. This is where I'm going to leave it. And no, I do not think any of this is easy. It is one thing to lay a structure out on paper. It is another thing entirely to get real people with real jobs, real exhaustion, real bills, real families, and real risk to move in a disciplined way against a market and political structure that is already better funded, already better connected, and already better organized. I understand that. The point here was never to pretend this is simple. The point was to show that it is not impossible. People have built pressure structures before. People have organized around donor mapping before. People have used records laws before. People have forced local officials to answer before. People have used petitions, turnout, testimony, and coordinated pressure before. None of that is fantasy, and none of it is exclusive to cannabis. This is not some magical new theory. This is political leverage, public discipline, and organized pressure applied to a market that keeps trying to hide behind the language of legality while narrowing who really benefits from it. And if somebody wants to wave this off as woke, leftist, or whatever other lazy label gets thrown at anything that threatens a comfortable power structure, then fine. Let them say it. That does not change what this is. This is not ideology. This is not performance. This is not people crying because they did not get their way. This is what it looks like when ordinary people stop confusing legality with fairness, stop confusing store presence with competition, and stop confusing silence with powerlessness. That is all this is. It is a framework for seeing the market clearly, seeing the hierarchy clearly, and understanding that public pressure still matters even in a system built to make people feel small. So that is where I'm going to leave it. This has been Jerry at CanIntel 420. And now, because somewhere out there an Ohio Hall monitor is already clutching a clipboard hard enough to snap it in half, here comes the disclaimer. This content is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice, not financial advice, not campaign advice, and not an instruction manual for violating any local, state, tribal, or federal law. Always follow the laws and regulations that apply where you live. There. The sacred disclaimer has been fed. The administrative cornfield spirits may now rest. The zoning goblins in Columbus can unclench. And whichever Buckeye-powered compliance ghoul was waiting to leap out of a township meeting packet whispering, "Gotcha," can go back to hibernation. Again, this has been Jerry at CanIntel 420. See you all in the next one.